Hi everybody, I'm going to do a quick overview of the 6 causes of the Great Depression for those of you that were not in class due to bubbling in things in your SATs. So like I said, we're going through causes of the Great Depression. There are going to be 6 of them. It's more than just the stock market crash. And we'll take it from there. So the first thing to understand is that the progress in the 1920s and all this calling it the roaring 1920s, it wasn't as great as we think it was. Most of the wealth was actually just created in the stock market and was limited to a very small percentage of the population. In fact, only about 1% of the American people owned any stock. And so we should take a minute right here to talk about what that means, what the stock market refers to. When you buy stock, you're buying a part or a share of a company. So if a company is doing really well, each year they're going to divide their profits amongst all their shareholders. If they're doing poorly, then you don't get anything as a shareholder. So you make money from the stock market in 2 ways. You make money from the shares that you own, and if those companies are doing well enough to pay what's called dividends to its shareholders, that's great. But the other way that you can make money in the stock market is by selling what you have, right? So your share of a company, people might really want that. If you own, say, shares of Apple, people might be really interested in that stock. And so they're going to be willing to pay a lot of money for it. Now, if there's some huge corporate scandal and we find out that Apple is, a terrible company, maybe they're slowing down their phones on purpose, then people may be less interested in that stock and it will become harder for you to sell. You'll have to drop your prices on it and you might lose money. So that's the second way of making or losing money on the stock market, is through this process of buying or selling your stocks. Either way, during the 1920s, stocks were growing incredibly, right? Dow Jones peaks in 1929 at a value more than 6 times as high in 1921. But that kind of growth is only impacting a very small amount of people. So the 1920s are a great time to be rich. They're like an average time to be middle class. Middle class wages were growing and consumer products were getting cheaper and cheaper due to mass production. But it's not a good time to be working class. Say you're one of the people working in the factories, or especially not a good time to be a farmer. So farmers, again, just like in the Gilded Age, are really left out of a lot of what's going on. During World War I, they borrowed a lot to be able to produce as much crops as possible. During World War I, they were really feeding both America and Eastern Europe and Western Europe. They were feeding a lot of people. Now that the war's over, they're not feeding as many people. And those crop prices are dropping. So they have to pay back money that they've borrowed, and they're not getting as much for their crops. It's kind of a bad situation for farmers. If we think about this, this helps us understand some of the cultural clashes that we've been talking about in the 1920s. If you're sort of left out of the prosperity and you're kind of watching what's going on in cities and you see these wealthy people, but you also see women behaving differently and people drinking alcohol when they're not supposed to be, you're going to maybe have a negative attitude towards the changes you're seeing. And that might help explain some of the negative attitudes towards science, towards immigrants in the cities, towards prohibition. And so I think that this economic gap helps explain some of the other gaps that are going on. Sorry. Okay. So the stock market does crash, and this is a spark that's going to set off a lot of problems in the 1920s, but it's not the entire cause. And in fact, if we had a stronger economy to begin with, the stock market crash really would have had nothing to do, wouldn't have had a big effect. We recently had a big drop in the stock market, but it didn't have a huge impact on the rest of our economy because we're in sort of a stronger place right now. So the market had been dropping for months. Basically, growth was slowing down. A lot of the growth in the economy in the 1920s came from industries like housing, automobiles, and those are the kinds of things where if you think about it, you buy them and then you hold on to them for 10 years, 20 years. And so a lot of that initial growth of the 1920s had stopped or slowed. As investors start to sell off stock, it causes other investors to panic, right? Because if you see everyone around you selling off stock, you think to yourself, man, it's going to be harder for me to sell mine. I'm going to have to drop my prices. And so then people decide to sell off theirs. And it kind of initiates a chain reaction. The worst of these days was October 29th, 1929, when the stock market crashed and investors lost a total of $14 billion. This money is essentially lost because it was all just kind of potential money to begin with, right? Like you have these pieces of paper that represent money and earnings. Now those earnings, those potential earnings are gone. Again, that isn't impacting only a very small number of people directly. However, banks during this time had supported a practice called buying on margin, meaning people could go to the banks, get a loan, and use that money that they borrowed in order to buy stocks. Very risky business. This is outlawed today. But so this practice of buying on margin meant that banks were actually vulnerable as a result of the stock market crash. And so banks start to get a little nervous and they start calling in loans, right? So people that have mortgaged their properties, maybe they needed to pay back those loans a little bit more quickly. People started to get nervous about what the banks were doing. And so during this period, we have a rush of bank failures. Over 9,000 banks failed. Here's a picture of one of these rushes. I need you to understand that these are kind of first come, first serve. Banks don't sit around with just piles of money in their vault. They're always lending that money out, loaning that money out. And so when people go to start to collect their deposits, there's not enough sitting in the bank. And because there's not enough sitting in the bank, some people are going to leave without any money. They just lose their savings. So you can imagine the impact that has. People start spending less, right? You don't have money, you're not going to spend money, right? You're not going to go out to dinner, you're not going to buy new clothes or new cars. And so this causes problems for all of these businesses. If people are spending less, businesses don't need to produce as much. So they're going to cut back their workers. So you have higher unemployment. This is what we call a recessionary spiral because it just keeps going around and around. If you have higher unemployment, that's even more people who are going to not be spending as much money, right? Which hurts businesses again. So this again is what I was saying, both companies and individuals stop spending. This leads companies to cut back jobs, which then comes back around again and people lower their spending even more. If we look at this graph, we can see that unemployment increases a huge amount in the 1930s to over 20%. That's 1 in 5 people being unemployed. This is going to have a dramatic impact on families. One thing that we see is that a lot of men leave home, and so women are left to care for their children on their own. Women, in many cases, women and minorities were considered the last hired and first fired, meaning that their jobs were not as important, or not considered to be as important or as valuable, and so that they were fired first. The men that went off to look for work became known as hobos, and they would ride the train cars illegally, right, jumping onto the back, and make their way across America looking for work. Minorities, like I said, are impacted the most out of this. So it becomes more difficult for minority groups to find jobs, African Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans, during this time, because again, the jobs were kind of saved for white men, the people that were valued the most in society. So government should play some kind of role in all of this, right? And what government decides to do is to protect American industry. And they do that by passing the Smoot-Hawley tariff. This was a bad idea. This basically promoted economic isolation. America wasn't trading with other countries. Other countries retaliated with tariffs of their own, and they were not trading with America. So that left kind of every country on its own to fend for itself, right? And to send to try to win their own way out of, or scrape their own way out of the Great Depression. And so that's a problem, and that decrease in trade is a huge problem. Our last and final cause that we're going to talk about today is the drought and the Dust Bowl. So we have all of this other stuff going on with the financial markets and with industry, and then Mother Nature steps in, right? And it's not just Mother Nature, because humans have had a huge impact on the environment of the Great Plains that is going to lead to some of these environmental problems. So in the 1930s, there were 3 waves of extreme drought, and these waves were known as for creating the Dust Bowl across the Great Plains. Originally, the Great Plains, right, were covered with grass, and that grass had a purpose. It kept the soil in place. As farmers started to produce more and more, and they dug up the grass and replaced it with other crops, they're really making the soil more prone to erosion. In addition, by farming the same crops over and over, they weaken the soil even further, right, by depleting it of certain nutrients. So the soil is weakened, and then there's no rain. And so that just leads to major dust storms that emerge as wind picks up across the plains. You have sort of like what would be rainstorms, but without the rain, right? That lead to these dust storms. And these dust storms would travel across the country. They could see results of these dust storms in Pittsburgh, Washington, D.C. You could feel the grit and the dust in the air. If you actually lived out on the plains, these were a health hazard. People could choke on the dust. Animals choked on the dust and died, so people lost their cattle, their chickens that they might use to support themselves and feed their families. And so many farmers eventually gave up their land, gave up their homes, and migrated westward. California was looked at as this sort of Garden of Eden type place, and Californians moved west to try to seek out new jobs and new work there. And they were known as Okies. If you've ever read The Grapes of Wrath, that gives you a really good depiction of what was going on at this time. You might also check out Ken Burns' Dust Bowl. It's actually really interesting about this time period. Just a couple of images. We have some great photos from this era, because one of the things that the government will eventually do is make up jobs. And they make up jobs like be a photographer, right? Take pictures of what's going on. And so we have quite a good record of what life was like during the 1930s. So I'm going to leave this slide here for a minute. You can come back and take a look at it, but just think about these 6 factors. What I want to talk about briefly before I run out of time is Hoover's response, which was basically very little and very late. Hoover was a product of an era where government was laissez-faire. It did not intervene. And this had kind of always been how government was. He was also living in an era where there was a lot of fear of Reds or communists. And so for government to get too big or too involved led people to accusations of communism or socialism, and he would certainly want to avoid that. So Hoover encourages people to seek out private charities like the Salvation Army or the YMCA. He eventually does create an organization called the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, but it was really considered to be too little, too late. And Americans hated Hoover as a result. People who lived in homeless encampments called them Hoovervilles. Men who walked down the street with empty pockets pulled out their pockets and called them Hoover flags. A Hoover blanket, that's when you cover yourself with a newspaper at night to sleep. Hoover made things quite worse. Well, this was a positive thing, the Boulder Dam, one of the projects of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, creating some jobs for workers. But overall, Hoover was not well liked, and he made things even worse with the Bonus Army incident, where veterans from World War I came to D.C. In order to get their bonuses paid early. Congress refused to pay those bonuses early, and Hoover asked the military to peacefully clear up the protest. But Douglas MacArthur, who's kind of a wild card, we'll learn about him more later on, didn't listen to the peaceful part of that, and very aggressively moved through the camps, used tear gas, and got the veterans to leave, but it didn't look good. This really clinched that Hoover would lose the election in 1932. FDR wins the election in 1932, and we're going to see a whole bunch of change in how the government decides to tackle this problem of the Great Depression. Woo! All right, I know I was talking fast, but go through, review those 6 concepts and make sure you know them as we move into the ways that government tries to solve a lot of these problems that we're talking about with the Great Depression. Bye, guys.